Begin with a gripping hook. The moment my life ended and this other life began wasn't when they fired me. It wasn't even when the smear campaign hit the papers, painting me as a delusional, paranoid crank. No, the real end. Leo Vance, once a respected environmental toxicologist, was now a punchline in municipal boardrooms. I had the data, the core samples, the spectral analysis showing that OmniCorp, with the city's blessing, had buried thousands of leaking barrels of an untested industrial solvent right under the foundations of the new Willow Creek housing estate. But they had the power. They buried my report, buried my reputation, and issued their own findings, full of reassuring words like inert and geologically stable. I was hollowed out. I took what's left of my savings and moved into a roach-infested motel on the edge of the county, a place that smelled of stale cigarettes and desperation. My office was a mess of topographical maps, chemical charts, and newspaper clippings. But my real laboratory was the earth itself. The whispers had already started. Farmers on the properties bordering Willow Creek were complaining. Corn that grew in tight, unnatural spirals, calves born with milky, cataract-filmed eyes, a strange phosphorescent algae blooming in the cattle troughs. I started investigating. I wasn't a toxicologist anymore. That field was too clean, too sterile for what was happening. I was wading into something else, something forbidden. I called it paranormal agrobiology, a term that earned me mocking laughter from the few colleagues I tried to contact. Listen to yourself, Leo. One of them told me over the phone before hanging up, "You're chasing folktales. Get help." The locals were no better. They saw my beat-up truck parked by their fields at dusk, saw me taking soil samples and setting up night vision cameras. They called me the dirt freak. They said I was poisoning their wells with my negativity, that my grief over my career had curdled into madness. But I knew what I was seeing. The mutations weren't random. They followed a pattern radiating outward from the Willow Creek development like a sickness breathing from the ground. I was documenting the planet's immune response to being poisoned, and it was horrifying. The horrific trials and dark triumph. The breaking point, the moment the dread became a physical entity, was 3 months into my exile. I was digging near an old, gnarled oak tree at the edge of a fallow cornfield. The soil felt wrong, spongy and warm. Even in the autumn chill, my shovel hit something tough and fibrous. I pulled, and a thick, pale root came free. And then another and another. They were tangled, woven together with a terrifying organic intelligence. And then I saw it. At the heart of the root ball, the pale in its flickering beam, I recognized the face of a little girl, Amelia Diaz, one of the first children in Willow Creek to be diagnosed with an aggressive, unexplainable leukemia. She'd been in the papers for weeks before she died. The earth was remembering. The toxins weren't just killing, they were assimilating. They were forcing the soil, the mycelial networks, the very DNA of the flora to create monuments to the dead. I spent the next year in a fever dream, digging. I unearthed dozens of them, the faces of the lost, the sick, the forgotten, their final agony rendered in root and soil. This was my proof. Not chemical charts, but the screaming faces of the earth itself. When I finally went public, it wasn't in a scientific journal. It was raw footage, uploaded to the internet. Me on my knees, hands caked in dirt, holding up a root system that wore the face of a dead child. The world reacted not with skepticism, but with pure primal horror. Investigations were reopened. The ground at Willow Creek was excavated. They found the barrels, thousands of them, leaking a poison that didn't just kill, it remade life into a memorial of its own victims. I wasn't a crank anymore. I was a prophet of a bio-horror nobody knew existed. My field of paranormal agrobiology was born, not in a lab, but in a mass grave. The return and unearthed truth. 5 years later, I came home. Not as the broken son, but as something else. I was a consultant for governments around the world. The man they called when the ground started acting strange. I carried an aura of dread with me. People lowered their voices when I entered a room. My father had invited me. He was older, grayer. Sarah was there, her kids playing in the living room. The air was thick with 5 years of unspoken words. They were proud, in a terrified sort of way. They saw my face on the news, heard my name spoken with a kind of grim reverence. After a tense dinner, I told them I had brought them a gift. From the back of my climate-controlled vehicle, I retrieved a sealed, museum-grade terrarium. Inside, bathed in a soft, sterile light, was a single, beautiful plant. Its leaves were pearlescent, its stem a pale, healthy white. It was grown from a soil sample I'd taken years ago, from their own backyard, not 5 miles from Willow Creek. "What is it?" Sarah asked, her voice a whisper. "A survivor," I said, placing it on the coffee table. "A specimen of Geophotographica memorialis, the species I discovered. It's perfectly safe in there." My father stared at it, his face pale. "Leo, why?" "Because you deserve the truth," I said, my voice cold and calm. "You always did. You just weren't willing to dig for it." I pointed to the glass. "Mom's cancer. You always called it bad luck. A 1 in a million tragedy." I let the silence hang in the air. Then I said, "Watch the roots." Under the soft lunt, deep in the sterilized soil, the pale, hair-like roots began to shift. It was an imperceptible, time-lapse movement, but in the focused silence of that room, it was as loud as a scream. Slowly, over the course of a minute that stretched into an eternity, the tendrils coiled, wove, and tightened. They sculpted themselves into a face they knew better than their own, my mother. Her eyes were closed, her mouth set in a faint, peaceful line, just as they remembered her in her final days. Sarah let out a choked, guttural sob and staggered back. My father collapsed into his armchair, his face a mask of absolute, soul-shattering horror. The proof wasn't in a government report or a news broadcast. It was here, in their living room, a ghost in the soil, a memory in the roots, a quiet accusation that would now sit in their home forever. The thing they had mocked me for, the obsession they had tried to medicate away, was the very thing that held the key to their own deepest tragedy. I didn't stay for their apologies. I didn't need them. I just looked at my father, at the man who had tried to commit me, now broken by a truth he couldn't unsee. "The earth remembers," I said, and walked out the door, leaving them alone with their beautiful, horrifying ghost. They call me a pioneer now, a warning. But I am neither. I am simply a man who learned to listen to the screaming in the soil, and who bears the terrible, vindicating silence that comes after.